Share screen. You guys let me know if you can see my my screen.
Yep.
Awesome. So I'm not able to see your chats. So if you have a question or if you want to interject, please just speak. Let's make this really informal. So the whole goal of this was to help people get started with podcasting. And so I'll introduce myself. I could talk forever about SEO, or search engine optimization, the consumer experience, and business disruptions, and the latest streaming shows. And of course, everything soccer, but I won't. I'll talk about podcasting today. Some of my favorite podcasts are, I don't know if you guys have heard of Pivot. It's absolutely my favorite podcast. Search News You Can Use, the Paid Search Podcast, Building a Better Agency, and the Bill Simmons Podcast. Obviously, most of these are centered around SEO and digital marketing, but some are for personal benefit as well. I also co-host a podcast called Think Jargon. So today's agenda, we just want to kind of briefly go over kind of the main bullet points of starting a podcast, using podcasts as content, finding your ideal listener, planning your episodes, your value proposition, choosing a podcast format, your podcasting toolkit, and growing your audience. Before we get right into it, I would love if you guys could tell me what your favorite podcast is. We'll start with Dan. Dan, what's your favorite podcast and why? Cool. Not sure if Dan's still on. Anyone want to?
No, my microphone takes like 10 seconds to unmute.
Oh, okay. Anyone want to interject with their favorite podcast? I'm sorry? Hello?
Dan Le Batard.
Oh, Dan Le Batard, yes. Former ESPN broadcaster. That's a great one. Anyone else?
Mine is My Favorite Murder.
My Favorite Murder. I like a lot of the mystery ones. Those are good. Anybody else?
Mine's The Morning Toast. It's a pop culture one though.
Nice.
Literally the only podcast I listen to, really.
Okay.
Mine
Jennifer.
is Creating Disney Magic. It's about taking the culture that they use at Disney and incorporating it into your life, your own career.
Love it. That's a good one. Is there a particular host that does that, or?
It's Jody Mayberry and Lee Cockrell, who used to be, I believe, the vice president of Magic Kingdom.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Well, that's what I love about podcasting is it could be on topics that you love. It could be about subject matter, like Jennifer loves Disney, Dan loves sports, and Lindsay loves murder mysteries, and Ashley obviously loves pop culture. So that tells me right there a little bit about you guys and your interest. And that's what I love about podcasts. There's literally like a podcast for everything. So we want to kind of use this as sort of a crash course on podcasting. So the first topic is podcasting as content. We all know in today's world, content is king. We do it with our agency for our clients with the written word and video and infographics. And now, obviously, you can also create content with podcasting. So what is a podcast? It's a program made available in the digital format for automatically downloading over the internet. Podcasting actually got started through Apple because they honestly wanted to sell more iPods. So kind of moving way back before the iPhone, their big device was the iPod. I'm sure everyone remembers the iPod and probably had one. That's where they got the word pod from, because podcasters would, air it on iPods. And so hence the word podcast. And then as podcasting became more popular, Apple, which really controls the rails of podcasting, because everyone just about in the world has their device. So they started supporting it by really just being the directory of sorts for podcasts. So when you get your iPhone, whatever version, that podcast icon is one of the main icons that you'll see when you open up your new iPhone. Today, it's sort of an interesting battlefield, if you will. Apple still owns the rails, so to speak. They have the device that everyone wants and uses for podcasts. But Spotify is really making a concerted effort into being a serious player in the market. Both just recently announced podcast subscriptions, and it's sort of interesting because Apple has really sort of taken the lazy approach, in my opinion, where they've just placed the icon on its iPhone, and really has just served as a directory of sorts where people can, stream and host their podcast, or not host, stream their podcast through the iTunes. But they really haven't tried to commercialize it or sell ads with it. And they just recently announced a subscription model, whereas Spotify has recently not only announced a subscription model, but they're also integrating advertising with it. So two different types of approaches. One being kind of more of we control the rails, we'll just be a directory, we're not putting much emphasis on it, to Spotify, which is making more of an effort to be the kind of central, almost like the Google of podcast. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans, or roughly 68 million people, are listening to podcasts on a monthly basis. So that's pretty strong numbers, and they're only growing. The main question, I guess, you have to ask is podcasting right for your business? In the short and sweet answer is yes, because pretty much you can create a podcast on just about anything. So if you think your business is too boring or no one's going to listen, you're actually fooling yourself. So there can be a podcast on just about everything. So there's no real kind of, the magic question is, well, how long does my podcast have to be? It's sort of like saying, how long does my blog or my video have to be? And really, there's no right or wrong answer. I would say make it as short or as long as you want it to be. A lot of times the subject matter, kind of the format, your goals, all of those things will dictate how long it has to be. For my particular podcast, Think Jargon, our goal was to reach business owners that are sort of overwhelmed by marketing and confused by marketing. We try to simplify it and talk about new marketing trends, and really kind of, take the jargon out of it and really speak in simple terms. So we're reaching that busy business owner or high-level executive or marketing executive. So our goal is to really, when we think about those people, the only time they probably can listen is probably in the commute to work or commute home. So we try to keep it, the average commute is 20 to 30 minutes. And that's what how we formulate our length of time for our podcast. But it can really be any length that you want it to be. this is an incredible stat. Weekly podcast listeners spend on average 6 hours and 37 minutes per week listening to podcasts. So, I'm probably close to that number. When I'm in the car, I'm always listening to podcasts. So my commute to and from work, or picking up the kids at school, I'm probably not quite at 6 hours a week, but I listen quite a bit. And think of yourselves. I mean, some of you may be hardcore podcast listeners, and you may listen more than that. I have a feeling with the audience here, it's probably a lot less than that. The great thing with podcasts, and why I asked earlier, with Jennifer's Disney and Dan's sports and so on and so forth, they're likely going to be more engaged when they're listening to podcasts of interest. So, the stat that was recently put out by Sumo found that average blog visitor reads only about a quarter of an article, where podcasts are different. 80% of the podcasts are listened to by the listeners in the audience. The average podcast listener listens to 7 different podcasts per week. I don't know if I listen to that many. I do have a diverse set, and it really depends on the mood that I'm in. Most of mine are work related. I do have a few personal ones like sports and soccer. So it depends. For me, it depends on sort of the mood I'm in. If I get tired of listening to work stuff, I'll change it up. And so I probably do have a pool of about 20 that I select from. I'm not sure if I do 7 a week, but it's interesting to see that the average is 7 different podcasts per week. That tells you how much this medium is growing. One of the things that is interesting and will be interesting to see with the approach Apple and Spotify are taking, they say that the podcast ads generate 4.4 times better brand recall. I think part of it is because a lot of those ads are live reads or read by the podcast host. And so you've sort of developed a connection with that person that's reading it. You also, a lot of times when they're reading them, they're not like commercials. There's no break per se. So it's right within the content. So it's another reason why those ads may be more memorable. Over $650 million was spent on podcast advertising in 2019. My guess is that will be double within a year. That's how fast this is growing. The format of a podcast is extremely convenient. You have the advantage of listening to it whenever, wherever. Obviously, the Apple devices and other devices make it, convenient for you to do so. You can listen to it, when you're walking your dog or in the grocery store. So pretty much you could be multitasking. Not sure where you guys listen to yours, but I know many different people use it, maybe even listen to it when they're exercising. So how do you get started? It's obvious that this is a field that's growing. So where do you start if you have an idea in mind and you're hoping to start a podcast? You would start with buyer personas. Just like any marketing campaign, you start with who your target market would be. And so finding your ideal listener is really where you would want to start. So if you have an idea, you would want to say, okay, if I come up with this podcast title, who the heck would be actually listening? And there's all kind of ways you can and reasons why you want to define your listener, but it helps narrow your audience. It helps concentrating your energy on the right topics. So when you have that target market in mind, you can kind of keep them front and center for everything that you do with your podcast. This is just a definition of the buyer persona. I know the audience that I'm speaking to today is quite familiar with buyer personas, but it is a semi-fictional representation of who your ideal customer base is. And it is all generated around the idea of birds of a feather flock together. So if you have one person in mind, most of the time, if they're the right persona, there are going to be many people that quote unquote look like them. And so that's who you want to market to. To answer your buyer persona or go through the exercise, you want to answer some of these questions like what are their demographics, what's their typical day like. Some of this is going to be a little bit more qualitative than quantitative, especially at the beginning because you have no data. So I would say don't let this overwhelm you. I would just say use general kind of educated guesses on who that typical audience may be. I wouldn't get too caught up in the details. This is way more than what we ever did for our podcast. I'm not going to read this because it's way too long, but you can kind of see what their typical buyer persona is. And they go through everything about their day, their interest, what their habits are, that sort of thing. So again, when you're creating topics and creating information regarding your podcast, you have a certain persona in mind. This is some of the ways where you can find your ideal listener. Again, I wouldn't go crazy with it at first, especially if you're just trying to get up and running. I don't think that it's really necessary, in my opinion, to go to these lengths, but you can. I think a lot of times people who want to start a podcast will let these sorts of things bog them down. And I don't think that's maybe the best philosophy, but these are some recommendations on how you can find your ideal listener. Once you have that in mind, you can start planning out your episodes. So again, this is where your buyer persona comes in. You can start to think of them, think of the questions that they have, think of some of the things that they may have, questions on, and answer them in just like you would in writing a blog or creating a video, but instead you're doing it in the podcast audio format. You can definitely brainstorm ideas. You can look at everything from what the content will be, what the title will be. If it's a certain title or topic and you have a certain guest or associate in mind that would be ideal, then have them on as a guest. We recently did one with Think Jargon where one of our team members, Madeline, is sort of experimenting with influencer marketing. And so we did a topic on influencer marketing and had her come in and speak on the topic, and she did a great job. Timeline, honestly, this is, again, very subjective, but you want to have some sort of organization or plan related to, what you want to do or accomplish. If it is something that like Think Jargon is for me, it's something that we do sort of in addition to everything we do for the agency. So we try to do one a week, and sometimes that's hard, but we try to stick to that one a week. But again, we're only 20-minute episodes, so we can produce 4 episodes in less than 2 hours. This is just a takeaway activity. Not going to make you do homework right now, but these are some things you need to ask yourself if you're thinking about starting a podcast. So these are some things that may help kind of get the wheels turning. Value proposition, just like any other business, you want to kind of what makes you or your podcast different from everything else, because obviously listeners have a choice, and so you want to be very distinguished as it relates to what your value proposition is. The first kind of rule of thumb when it comes to value proposition is make sure that in order to connect with your audience, you want to be kind of human and helpful. Obviously, you're going to be human, but you want to be helpful in the content that you provide. Don't make it overly salesy or overly pushy. Make it just something that the listener enjoys consuming. So value proposition is a promise of value to be delivered should someone choose to buy or use your product. So for podcasting, like for Think Jargon, our value proposition is just to simplify marketing and make business owners' life easier by not being so confused and overwhelmed. So a value proposition is based on who is your ideal listener, what makes your show unique, give them a reason why they would want to tune in, and what makes it different. HubSpot does a podcast called Skill Up, and their audience, their ideal consumer obviously are marketers, particularly marketers that are just getting started. And so their podcast takes a topic and teaches marketers how to become more professional and dynamic within that topic. Maybe it's, how to create and market YouTube videos, and they'll have a whole season on that particular topic. So that's what sort of is their value proposition and what makes them different. So another takeaway is, take your favorite podcast that you guys mentioned earlier and kind of try to decide what that value proposition is. An example, my favorite is Pivot, and it's technology based, and it's two rather well-known people. Kara Swisher is a technology journalist and has been for years, and has covered technology for many, many years, writer for New York Times, just a really well-known journalist, probably the most well-known journalist inside of tech. And then Scott Galloway is a professor, marketing professor at NYU, and has written about 5 books on marketing. And their banter back and forth is what makes their podcast really, really entertaining. They also have connections with the top people in tech. So they're a lot of times interviewing, anyone from Elon Musk to, Jeff Bezos. So they have, they're really well connected, but their value proposition is giving sharp, unfiltered insights into the biggest stories in tech, business, and politics, mostly in tech. And they're, in my opinion, they're bickering and bantering back and forth is what makes it kind of entertaining and why I want to listen every week. This is a good question to ask yourself if you want to start a podcast, is what format do you want to use? And why you want to ask yourself that is because that format sort of structures the rest of your podcast, and it really gives you more direction in which way to go. So there's all kinds of different podcasts. And if you think of your favorite podcast as an example, just kind of see where yours fits in this one. There are podcasts that are solo hosts. So basically it's just one person and they're talking about a particular topic. There's also co-host, which like Pivot, there are 2 hosts and they talk back and forth and obviously use a topic or discuss a topic with one another. Think Jargon is a co-hosted format. There's an interview format where one person interviews different topics, different subjects. One of the podcasts that I listen to is literally a guy that reads marketing books, and he interviews the authors of those books each week. And so he just takes a new marketing book every week, and he interviews the authors about that book. There's also panels. This is probably my least favorite because in my opinion, everyone on the panel wants to speak. And if you have 4 or 5 people on the panel, they end up speaking over one another. And it's just, in my opinion, the best podcast, but it can be. And then there's a storytelling that's perhaps, I don't know this to be a fact, but I would guess, like Lindsay said, she likes the kind of mystery podcast. Usually those are more in the storytelling style. So the solo, it's pretty self-evident. It's, flexible. Editing is easier because it's just you, and you can develop your own personal brand by doing a solo cast. Some examples are Skill Up, seasons 2 through 4. Search News you can use with Dr. Marie Haynes. She's a great SEO kind of influencer and knows her stuff. So that's a good example of a solo podcast. Co-host, it's pretty evident what that is. It's 2 people that host the podcast. Some examples are Pivot, the Paid Search podcast, and the infamous Think Jargon. Interviews are good because it allows each week or each episode, there's a different perspective and a different voice, if you will. So it's definitely a good format. Obviously, the person that hosts it has to be a good interviewer, but it makes for a good podcast format. Some of the examples are the Joe Rogan Show, Agency Unfiltered, and the Marketing Book podcast, which is what I was referencing earlier. Panels, again, not my favorite, but some people may like them. There's plenty of opportunities for topics and subject matter because you have more kind of more knowledge within more individuals. Some examples are This Week in Local, Marketing O'Clock, and the Hubcast are some examples of panel style podcast. Storytelling, again, pretty self-explanatory. It tells a story and it's less interview style, less one host, and it's more about telling a story. Again, some of the mysteries, Noble Blood, Dr. Death, Lore, those are all examples of storytelling podcast. The next topic is the toolkit. So this is probably the one thing that maybe is overwhelming for most people because you have to have a little bit of knowledge in the tech field. You don't have to be an expert, but it does require a little bit of tinkering with some tools, but they have made it so easy that just about anyone can do it now. And I'll be the first to tell you, I'm no professional when it comes to putting this stuff together, but here are some tips as it relates to the things that you need to create a podcast. When it comes to recording audio, pretty much any tool that records audio would be fine for a podcast. You got apps like GarageBand, QuickTime, Audacity, but then there's also some paid options. Anchor was purchased by Spotify, and what I like about Anchor is it's a sort of an all-in-one tool, and it's on your iPhone, so it's an app. Literally, you can just create everything from audio to the music bed, to the intros, outros, and the hosting of the podcast as well. Everything can be done through Anchor. These are just pro tips for when you're recording audio or recording your podcast. Do it in a quiet room, wear headphones, and speak directly into your microphone. I think those are all obvious tips, but they are helpful ones. Here are some just options as it relates to headphones. There's low cost options like earbuds or a USB headset. There's mid cost, like the Blue Yeti is very, very popular. And then there's other high cost options that are $100 plus for microphones. When you're recording solo, try it like in a more enclosed room. I'm not sure about the whole 2 pillows theory. I've never really tried that, but the goal is to, reduce any kind of bounce back and making your room a little bit more less echoey. And some of the ways to do that would be using pillows. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of ways to upload your audio for podcast and host it. So you do have to have some sort of host / RSS feed. These are just some of the ones that are options. There are many, many others. For Think Jargon, we use a company called Captivate, but it's relatively easy to upload. The user experience is pretty seamless, and it doesn't require, there's no learning curve. If any, it's a very, very slight learning curve at most. There's also best practices as it relates to uploading your episodes. You're going to want to create a title. You're going to want to tag it. You're going to want to use certain art and a short description of why someone would want to listen to the episode. Some tips, and we do use this tip a lot, is have multiple episodes recorded. We try to record 4 at a time, but again, that's very subjective. There's some other editing options for your podcast episodes. I'm not an editing expert, so I'm not going to kind of dive deep into this. But there are many online courses and many valuable assets on the web that will help you with your episode editing, some of which were mentioned earlier in the software like Anchor, where it's all in one. We're going to move on to kind of additional apps. We mentioned Anchor.fm. It's probably one of the more popular ones. There are transcript apps that will help you transcribe your podcast episodes. And then there's also some free or subscription-based bumper music options out there, things like YouTube Studio and Audio Jungle. Once you record it and you publish it, now it's about growing your audience and marketing it. The steps that HubSpot recommends is to create a website and social media accounts, promote, engage with listeners, and build a community. So we'll cover those real quick. We have a website for Think Jargon. It's thinkjargon.com. We post the episodes on there. We have a little bit of information about each of the hosts, and we have sort of like a countdown to the next episode. So it helps us kind of establish a identity on the web, and it helps people find us easier. It also helps us build kind of relationships with the audience. Some of the ways you can promote your podcast, obviously the website, but also creating a blog on your website, having social media posts. For Think Jargon, we do post consistently every week. And depending on the topic, I think that will dictate where you post, what social media posts, or what social media platforms you use. So, if it's more business based, obviously LinkedIn would be a good place, and perhaps Twitter. But if it's more social or kind of leisure, then Facebook and perhaps Instagram may be better. But that's sort of a more subjective thing, and it's where your buyer personas would come in. Engage with listeners. Obviously, ask them questions. Ask them to respond. Ask them to give you ratings on their favorite platforms. All of these things help with pushing your podcast higher and higher and getting more, kind of amplifying the signal, if you will. Building a community, starting a hashtag so your listeners can easily see what others are saying. You can also start a Facebook group. Obviously show appreciation and engage back with listeners. We have not done any type of live event, but it certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think that is another way of, building an audience and building engagement. Here's some of the next steps and resources. If you are interested, you can reach out to us as a team. We're at Blinkchart Media on Twitter. You can reach out to me personally at Jared Broussard. So those are ways that you can contact us for any more information, any more questions related to the podcast. We'd love to hear your feedback. So obviously ask questions or comment in the comment space. There are multiple ways where you can learn more about podcasting. HubSpot has several resources that you can use. They also have a course in the academy that you can take. These are some of the resources we use to build this presentation. And obviously you can, like I said before, reference HubSpot Academy for more information on podcasting. And that is all I have on podcasting. I am happy to take any questions. Thank you for the time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Cool. Good job, Jer.
All right. I'm going to stop recording. Thanks for listening.